Hello wine lovers, Trophy Wine Hunter, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'm doing a video on Barolo. Why am I interested in Barolo? Well, a couple of reasons. One, I think I need a break from Bordeaux. I've been drinking a lot of Bordeaux, as people who follow my channel know. That's kind of my main area of drinking, and then maybe a lot of French wines, including Burgundy also. But I've always liked Italian wines, and I've always liked Barolo, but I thought I should really know a little bit more about it. Second reason is just it happens there's been a number of dinners that are coming up that involve Italian producers and Barolo producers. So I had a really great opportunity to have dinner with Giulia Negri, who is kind of commonly known as Barolo Girl. She's one of the most innovative people in the region, and I got so much information from her. And then the last thing is that from a investment and a drinking perspective, I think that's where the market is going. Because if you look at the trends, I'll explain that through this video, and also what's happening with Burgundy, everyone is really looking for an alternative for Burgundy. And Burgundy is getting very, very expensive for beginners to get involved with, so they can't really drink it. Whereas Barolo, as I'll explain through this video, has many of the characteristics of Burgundy, and with global warming, I think there's a real opportunity for these wines to not only appreciate in price, but also to take a more center stage in terms of the preferences of drinkers. I treat myself as a beginner in terms of Italian wines. Of course, I'm like most consumers, I drink Italian wines and I do enjoy Barolo, but I've really never put a lot of my time or effort into understanding Barolo. So I've kind of dived into it and tried to drink a lot of Barolo over a very little time frame. And that's, to me, the only really way to understand the region. You can do a lot of research, you can do a lot of reading, but ultimately it's about your own palate and what you can taste, not what other people can tell you you should taste. So Barolo is a wine region located in Italy, and specifically in Piedmont. So Piedmont is in the northwestern part of Italy, and it borders France and Switzerland. All Barolos must be made with 100% Nebbiolo grapes. And so Nebbiolo is a small, thick-skinned grape that is generally high in acid and high in tannins. But it's a very fickle grape. It's difficult to grow, and it buds early and ripens very late. And so for that reason, there's not very many places that you can grow Nebbiolo. And the perfect place to grow that is in the Piedmont region, and in particular places like Barolo and Barbaresco. People believe that the person that created the dry style of Barolo was a person called Louis Oder, which is a Frenchman. He was hired by Camillo Benzo, who is the Count of Cavour, to modernize their estate by making a drier style wine. We now know that actually that's not correct. In fact, it's another person who should get the credit, Paolo Francesco Stagliano, because we know now that Mr. Oder was not an enologist at all. He was a wine and grape merchant. So basically he's got a lot of the credit for it, but in fact now we know it's actually not him that did this. So there was a noble person called Giulietta Faletti, or the Marchioness of Barolo, who enlisted, I guess, Mr. Oder's help. Now, he was a wine merchant, and so he knew the technique, but he didn't create the technique. So he did develop it, and they did such a good job with this Bordeaux style type wine that it drew the attention of King Carlo Alberto. And because it started to get within the nobility, that's how we got this association with kings, and it became the wine of kings, or the king of wines. Barolo wines must be aged at least 38 months before they're released, and at least 18 of those months must be in oak. Now, some producers do age it even longer than that, but these are minimum standards. If a Barolo is labeled Reserva, then it must be aged 62 months before release, of which 18 must be in oak. And of course, it goes back to the grape type. The grape type Nebbiolo, which is thick-skinned, produces a lot of tannins in the wine, and they need this type of aging to be released in order for the wine to be drinkable. Barolo grapes must be grown within a certain altitude, between 170 and 540 meters above sea level. That's because if it's planted too low, then it can't ripen, and if it's ripened too high, again, it's too cold. The most valuable vineyards, the generic or the traditional thinking is that they should be mid-slope. That's where the sun will have the most exposure, and facing southeast, south, or southwest, because that's where they get the maximum sun exposure. So those sunny parcels are labeled Sori or Bricco. Sori means they have the most sun exposure. Bricco means those are plots in the upper part of the hill. There's a maximum yield for how many grapes that you can grow per hectare. If producers choose to go beyond those yields, then they cannot label themselves Barolo. They have to label themselves Langhi. So Langhi is the Breda region, of which Barolo and Barbaresco are part of. It is a DOCG region. And so what that means as compared to a DOC region in Italy is that it means it's guaranteed. So the quality is guaranteed. How do they guarantee quality? Firstly, by things such as controlling the yields, but secondly, by actually the wines have to be tasted, and it's subject to a tasting. Now, you can always say, maybe that's not a very high standard, but at least they have to pass a quality test. Barolo is made up of 11 villages, but the nice thing is that there's only 5 that actually produce most of the Barolo wines. That's 90% of the Barolo wines. So these are Barolo, La Mora, Castiglione Felletto, Serralunga d'Alba, and Monteforte d'Alba. In addition, there's another 170 what they call MGAs or sub-regions or cru regions. You'll see that on bottles. So for instance, with these 2 bottles, this is Masolino. It says Serralunga d'Alba on this bottle, and so that comes from the general commune or village of Serralunga d'Alba, which is quite a big area. This is Battisolo, and it says Busia. So Busia is basically a MGA or what you call a cru. The only problem with this is that, again, these regions are very large. So Busia and some of the other ones like Canubi, they are really large regions, and they have really varied altitudes in terms of their vineyards. So you cannot just say every Canubi wine is going to be the same in terms of the quality. Generally, Barolo can be divided into 2 regions. The first is the Serralunga Valley, which encompasses mostly Castiglione Felletto, Monteforte d'Alba, and Serralunga d'Alba. And then the second is called the Central Valley, which covers mostly Barolo and La Mora. So there is some overlap, but these are kind of general concepts. So the Serralunga Valley, in general, the soil is sand and limestone, and they produce more intense wines that need a longer period to age to become drinkable, whereas the Central Valley, La Mora and Barolo have clay soils which produce softer, fruitier wines. At higher altitudes, the vines are going to be exposed to cooler temperatures and a shorter growing season, and so generally the soils in high altitude are less fertile, and it forces the vines to work harder. And as a result, the grapes tend to ripen more slowly, and they produce wines with greater concentration of flavor and higher acidity. So in general, higher altitude Barolos will have lower alcohol levels, be a little bit more elegant, a little bit lighter bodied, more intense aromas. And in general, you'll find higher altitude wine Barolos some of the most expensive Barolos. So lower altitude Barolos tend to be fuller bodied, richer, more pronounced tannins, and higher alcohol. These are wines that generally the consumers are more aware of, or it's more in the consumer eyes. So this is sometimes the question you have, is I've always had, is how come there's such a huge variation in price of Barolos? And I think part of it has to do with altitude, because in general, the wines that are a little bit more affordable are gonna be the lower altitude, that can be more intense flavor, more higher alcohol content, a little bit fruitier, and the higher altitude is probably going to be a little bit more difficult to grow, and therefore it's going to be a little bit more refined, a little bit more elegant, and so those wines generally will attract higher prices. There's also two schools of thinking in terms of Barolo. There's the traditional method of making Barolo, which is using large Slovakian casks. And why they do that is because these old casks don't really impart a lot of oak, but they're kind of a vehicle to be able to store wines for a long period of time. Going back to the Nebbiolo grape, it needs a long aging time. So you want something that's going to be able to store the wine in a sterile environment, but not impart a lot of flavors. Because if you store kind of wines in new oak barrels for 3 years or 5 years, that will impart a lot of other flavors into there. What you want is that for a traditional style Barolo, you want the grape to show itself and really not be much more natural. Now, the modernist approach to Barolo is to use smaller French barriques. When you use smaller barriques, basically you're going to impart flavors, so you can't put it in there as long, but it also speeds up the process of fermentation. In the modern environment, people are not prepared to wait. You know, when we get wines, they're sold very young and they're drank very young. So people don't really want to wait like they did in, let's say, the 1800s, when they were happy to wait 15, 20 years for a wine. Nowadays, we can't do that. We're just not prepared to do that. We want wines that we can drink right away. When we go to a restaurant, we want a wine that's going to decant for an hour. That's kind of the modern, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but that's the modern palate, and that's the modern consumer. So with that in mind, some modern producers have now tried to speed up the process of Barolo by putting them in French barriques, smaller barriques. Traditional winemakers who put them in large oak casks would ferment for between 3 weeks to 2 months. But the modern style of Barolo maker will shorten the maceration time and the fermentation time to maybe like 10 days. So, and that will be in new French oak barrels, and that will, you know, add some other flavors to it. Most producers nowadays use a combination. So there's no right or wrong answer about how it's done. And I think in general, you know, they talk about Nebbiolo wars. It was never a war. If you talk to producers in Barolo, they're all friends. There's no war. There's differences of thinking, but the people are not going to, you know, war with each other. So that's really a media thing, and that's a thing that people say. It's popular, it's catchy, But to think that winemakers are at each other's throats is not right. In fact, most of these winemakers in Barolo and in Piedmont know each other. They work with each other. Their families have all worked with each other. So there's no war. There's just a difference of opinion. A lot of people think Nebbiolo is named after the fog that develops over the area in the midday because of the mist and the influences of the water around it. In fact, it's probably because the actual grape is a little bit foggy. So that's where the name Nebbiolo comes from. Nebbi means fog. From my perspective, Barolo, I think a lot of it has to do with altitude. Barolo, that's made from the Nebbiolo grape, is grown between 170 and 500 meters above sea level. So my thinking was, well, it's got to be the best grapes have to be in the middle. And if you take it in half, then you'd take, maybe 300, 350 would be the perfect and ideal place in terms of altitude. But I forgot that actually it slopes. So probably because the sun comes up like this, you probably actually want it a little bit higher. So now my thinking is about you want to see in Barolo vineyards probably the best ones between 400 to 440 square meters. That changed when I talked to Giulia Negri, who grows her Nebbiolo at almost 500 meters above sea level. So I asked her, I said, how does that happen? Because the traditional thinking is you can't grow the best Barolo in that height because you're not going to get maximum ripeness. And it's going to be cold, and with the long ripening season, you won't be able to grow Nebbiolo to a ripeness that has that intensity of flavors. So she asked me to drink her wines. I've drank her wines, which I will hopefully review in the future, and they were spectacular. So what she explained to me is this is the old thinking, and global warming has really affected this, because with global warming, what has happened is that at high altitude, the summers have become much more consistent and the winters have become much milder. So at the higher altitudes, basically the extremes have gone. And what that has done is actually allowed Barolo producers to produce better ripening. So what she told me is that if you look back at the history of Barolo, let's say when you go back to the 60s to the 2000s, over that 40-year period, there was very few great vintages in Barolo because there was a lot of years where there was not enough heat to ripen the Nebbiolo grape. So you might have like 5 great vintages. Now, with global warming, the good effect on Nebbiolo grape is that almost every vintage in the last 15 years has been hot enough. And therefore, it is great for Nebbiolo. Because Nebbiolo, again, you have to remember, it needs long ripening. It needs heat, but it needs consistent heat. And it buds early. So the heat has to be, or the warmth has to come early and has to last a long time. And one of the effects of global warming is that has heated everything. And if you think about it, even if we're talking about a degree or 2 degrees, that's very significant for a grape like Nebbiolo. One of the effects of global warming that there are some grape types that probably perform better, which is Nebbiolo and maybe Cabernet Sauvignon, and there's some grape types that probably will do worse, which is Pinot Noir. And so that's what I think you're going to see in the future, that the Pinot Noir grape is going to be harder and harder to grow in Burgundy, and therefore the prices of Burgundy, which are all based a lot on supply and demand, the supply is going to be harder to find, which means it's going to be increasingly expensive. People will need to find affordable alternatives to Burgundy, And the affordable alternative to me looks like Barolo and the Nebbiolo grape in particular. So if you were kind of buying for the future, that's probably where you would want to shift your attention. Nebbiolo-based grapes, wines will go up in price because the demand will be there and their consistency is getting better and better with global warming. And what's the top end Nebbiolo grape wine? Barolo. That's the reason why, as a wine drinker or a wine collector or a wine investor, that where you should turn is to Barolo in the next couple of years, because that's going to be where I think the money and the action is going to be and the interest is going to be over the next 5 to 10 years. All of the kind of facts I've given you is interesting, but I was really taken aback when I was talking about this and all these different things to Julia. And Julia basically said, stop thinking, Tony, just drink. And really, that's great advice. You can have all these things and have all these theories and read all these things, but the proof is in the actual tasting of the wines. Don't worry about the points. Don't worry about the vintage. Taste it. And then, based on those tastings, make your assumptions, some of which will match, some of them won't. Because I've tried to come up with some hard and fast rules for Barolo, but what I found is there's so many exceptions that it really needs to taste, and it's your personal preference that's so important. What have I found out about myself and what have I discovered about Barolo over the last little while that I've tasted? Well, I know firstly that I still have a lot to learn, and my views of Barolo will continue to evolve, but those will only evolve by myself tasting more Barolo. It won't evolve by me doing any more research, because I can't prove that. I can't experience that for myself. What I have learned in terms of my tasting is that I do generally prefer higher altitude Barolos. Those are generally a little bit more aromatic, floral, a little bit lighter in alcohol, and a little bit more ethereal. I actually enjoy that style of wine, and so that kind of is consistent because I like Bordeaux, I like Burgundy. If you're a drinker that likes more New World wines like Napa Cabernets or Australian Shirazes, then I would look towards Barolos that are lower altitude and also come from the Serralunga Valley, which are going to be more hardy, tannic, high alcohol, fruitier. And so that's kind of the stylistic, for me, the approach. The other thing that I've noticed is that just in tasting different wines, it really struck me that, when I drank Julia's wines, those are very, she's got limited production, but I really like the sophistication of the wines. They were very ethereal. They were thinking wines. And I really was struck in terms of the difference between those wines and what typically I associate with Barolo, which is a wine like Batisolo. Batisolo is great wines, but I think for me, their style is a little, I don't know if commercialized is the right word, but it's a more generic wine than compared to Giulia Negri's wines. And I haven't had a lot of older Barolo, and that's my next step, to really try to start tasting older Barolo. But what I think I'm finding, at least, is that the lower altitude Barolos, generally speaking, they can drink a little bit more quickly. So their age, they can age maybe 10 years and they'll still be excellent. So this is an example which I hopefully will review. This is the Barisolo Lucia Bofani. This is 2010. I think it's drinking pretty decently right now. The advantage of this older style, which is a style I think I prefer, is that it will be more pure in terms of the Nebbiolo grape. And so I think what happens when you put Nebbiolo or produce Nebbiolo in a modern style, it's very pleasing earlier, but it does impart some oak and other flavors into the Barolo, which, if you are a traditionalist, may hide the kind of the gentleness or the subtleness or the elegantness of the Nebbiolo grape when it ages. It'll be interesting because this is my first foray into Barolo, and I'm probably sure we'll have a lot of debate from more experienced Barolo drinkers. But hopefully in 3 or 4 years, I'll do another video on Barolo and re-edit my views on Barolo. I wanted to do this video to show you the process that I think is important to go through as a wine drinker. As a wine drinker and a consumer, we don't know everything. I'm not a wine expert. I'm not paid to be a wine expert. And even wine experts need to get re-educated. They need to retaste. And so reading, studying is great, but you really have to taste. And you have to experience yourself and make your own opinions, form your own opinions. And then buy those wines which please you. Not please the experts, not because they have high point scores, because those really mean very little in the whole scheme of things. It's the journey to understanding the wine and having that understanding being personalized to you. So it's really, I'm hoping that this will spur viewers into drinking more Barolo and having more interest in Barolo. I don't want you to take my views and just say, well, those are great views and I'm going to adopt those views. Don't do that. Question them. Taste for yourself and come to your own conclusions. Hope this video has been useful. Until next time, happy drinking.